Well, everyone, my name's Jess Mitchell and I'm the Environmental Engagement Officer from the City of Marion, and I'm your host this evening. Nina Mani, which means welcome in Kaurna language. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and for all of us to reflect on the traditional owners of the land in which each of us stands or sits this evening, wherever we are, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. So this evening, you are joining us for one of a series of 4 gardening topics that we'll be covering over the next few months. So if after tonight you're interested in being part of the next couple of workshops, you can sign up to our e-newsletter by emailing us at environment@marion.sa.gov.au, and we'll put that email address in the chat a bit later this evening. Tonight, we are learning to grow from seed. We've got a special guest with us, John Butler, who's from Heirloom Harvest. And we're going to learn heaps from him. I'm super excited. We've also got Danny Austin, who is our Community Gardens Coordinator at City of Marion. She's going to briefly talk to us after John's given his presentation about community gardens in the City of Marion. After Danny's had her quick talk, we'll move over into Q&A time. So John and Danny will answer your questions and we'll wrap up by 8 o'clock. So without further ado, I will hand over to John, who's going to take us away for this evening. John, over to you.
Alrighty. So hello everyone. I'll just give you a quick introduction to myself. I'm still seeing you, Jess. Are we, for some reason, am I all good? All right, so I'll just give a quick introduction to myself. I have 2 different hats that I wear, both relating to seeds and germinating seeds. So one is I have a commercial organic market garden, which we produce lots of fresh fruit and veggies organically, which we sell at local farmers markets in a few local shops. But I also have a seed business called Heirloom Harvest, where I grow plants through and seed save them and then sell those seeds as well. So have a lot of experience growing seeds, so hopefully I can pass some of that experience and knowledge on to you now. So I'll just prepare a bit of a slideshow, so I'll just put that up here for you all now. Okay, so I'll start off with a little bit of biology, just because it's very, very important to understanding how to germinate the seeds. So if you understand the biology of what germinating seeds involves, then it'll just make much more sense when you're trying to work out the practical actions to take when you're trying to germinate the seeds. Okay, so what is a seed? So to start with, a seed is actually a baby plant. So it's a living plant, it's alive, just like any other plant. It's just that it's very small and in a dormant state. So you can think of it a bit like an egg, like a chicken's egg. When it's, before it's hatched, it's got the little embryo in there, and it's got some food storage there for the chicken to grow. Just like the seed has got some food storage there for the plant to grow, and it's in a protective shell to stop it from getting damaged while it's growing. And yeah, it's just the plant is just sitting there in that dormant state, just waiting for the right environmental conditions for it to take off and start growing. When the plant gets those right conditions, it goes through a process which is called germination. And that's when the plant gets the right environmental stimulus to actually start to grow from the seed. So So the germination is the process when the seed goes from in that dormant state to actually beginning to grow. So there's 3 things that are required for the seed to be stimulated to change from the dormant state to the growing state. And they are water, oxygen, and the biggest one, or not the biggest one, but a very important part of it is the right temperature. So every different crop that you grow, so carrots, tomatoes, they all have a different optimum temperature range, which they will germinate within a certain range and won't germinate if it's too hot or too cold. And that's a result of the environments in which they've evolved. So the plants which have evolved in more tropical climates, such as tomatoes, tend to have a lot warmer temperatures that they require to germinate. And then plants which have evolved in cooler climates tend to, like something like lettuce, require a much lower temperature to be able to germinate. So when they germinate, the correct temperature and water combination will change the chemical reactions inside the seed, and it'll start to grow. So when it starts to grow, it is using that stored food that it has within the seed to grow for the first little while. And so because of that, because it's using its stored seed, it actually doesn't require any fertilizer at this point in time. It's just growing from that stored food within the seed. So once the seed has germinated and is starting to grow, it keeps growing using that stored energy and food from within the seed, right up until the point where it pops out of the soil or emerges. And that's when it can start to photosynthesize and use the light energy to create its own food. So at that point of time, the seedling does require fertilizer because it's used up all its storage of food just to to get its head up above the soil. And that's when it starts to actually absorb nutrients from the soil and use those to continue to grow. Okay, so knowing that background of what actually happens when a seed's germinating, we can use that when we're actually going about the process of growing plants from seeds to make sure we get the best out of the germination of the seeds and the growing of the seedlings. So as I said before, we need a combination of water, oxygen, and temperature. So the seedlings usually are grown in a soil, some sort of soil. And so that soil then needs to be able to supply them with the nutrients, the water, and the oxygen. So just because the seed doesn't actually require any nutrients to germinate, it's much easier to just have some nutrients in the soil already when you plant the seed, so that they're there ready for it when it does need it. So having the nutrients in the soil at the start is the easiest way to go about it. Just from a practicality perspective, seedlings or seeds are usually, a lot of seeds you can plant directly into a garden. So, and a lot of seeds do best planted directly into a garden. So that is especially the root crops, like things like radish, carrots, beetroots, those type of things do best when they're planted directly where you want them to grow, just because the disturbance of the roots when you're transplanting them is not really good for those sorts of plants, which the main part of them which you're wanting to grow is the root. A lot of those seeds you have to plant straight into the garden, and that means you can only plant them at the time of year when those correct temperature requirements are kind of met naturally, I guess. But for most other seedlings, you can actually start them indoors or in a nursery situation where it's much easier to control the water and the temperature. Most people that are growing vegetables are growing from seedlings and then transplanting them. So So to do that, we need some sort of soil or seed raising mix to raise the seeds in. So that seed raising mix needs to be able to supply the seed with the water and the oxygen that they require to germinate. So to do that, it needs to have the right porosity or the right water holding capacity. So you want it to be able to be free draining, but you also want it to stay moist. So it's kind of a bit of a balancing act. And also there's too much fertilizer in the soil can actually inhibit the germination of some seeds. So just out of ease, I like to just make one mix which I plant the seeds in and let them grow through until I'm going to plant them out into the garden. So because of that, I like to put fertilizer in that one mix, and so I don't have to pot them up. But you also can't put too much fertilizer in. So it's a bit of again, it's another balancing act between having enough fertilizer for them to grow through and not having too much to inhibit the germination. So the mix which I personally use, I use about equal parts of compost, perlite and vermiculite for this time of year, and then a very small amount, like about 0.5% of blood and bone for the fertility. But during summer, I change the perlite out for some coir because it holds a bit better moisture. So during summer, you want to hold more moisture. During winter, you want to make it a little bit more able for the water to flow through and excess water to flow out of the seed raising mix. So as I was saying before, the pores in the soil, getting the right balance between water and oxygen is extremely important. So you can see in the diagrams there, on the left-hand side, it's got all the soil particles with water all around it. And then on the right-hand side, the soil particles hold on to, with like a bit of a static charge, to hold on to water on the surface on them. So you can have a thin film of water around all of the soil particles, which actually isn't available to the plants. So you're trying to get that right balance where it's holding on to enough water, but still letting the oxygen in, because the roots of the plant so plants require oxygen just like every living thing does. And yeah, the roots of the plants are no different to that. So if you have too little water holding, the plant will wilt and will grow poorly. But then if you have too much water, you can't get enough oxygen, and it also increases the likelihood of dampening off, which is a fungal disease, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But it also can increase the amount of leaching of the nutrients. So if you water it too much, or the water, if the soil, the seed raising mix can get soggy, then it can dissolve a lot more of those nutrients and wash them out when you're watering. Okay, so if we're growing seedlings in a nursery situation, or in a windowsill or some sort of other situation rather than out in the garden, we need to be able to actually contain the soil that we're using to grow them in, but we also need to be able to transport the plants from where we're growing them out to the garden where they're going to be planted. So usually that's done by using some sort of container to put the soil in, and the containers need to be large enough to hold enough moisture and enough nutrients for the plant to grow big enough until you plant it out. So as a general rule, a bigger container is better when you're planting seeds. You don't need it to be bigger than it's going to then it needs to grow its roots to the size that you're going to plant it out. So you don't need a huge bucket for a little lettuce seedling, but also you do want it to be big enough that the roots of the lettuce seedling aren't going to be constricted in their growth. As soon as you start constricting the root growth of a plant, you start constricting the growth of the whole plant. So it also needs to have drainage holes in it, so that that seed raising mix can free draining so that we don't get waterlogging, as I was saying before. And yeah, it also needs to be durable enough to be able to move to the garden without it damaging the plant. So there's a few different types of containers that are common. They're probably the most common type are plastic containers. So some of the good things about that is that they're readily available, they're very durable, they hold in the moisture and can reuse them over and over and over again, which makes them the use of the plastic a little bit less of a environmental issue. But the cons are that they do end up eventually as plastic waste. And they also are a lot more prone to creating root binding, which is that constriction of the roots to the area within the cell of the container that you're growing them in. So then there's other options like biodegradable containers. So they can be made out of paper at home. They can be old egg cartons. You can buy specifically made seed raising cells, which some people know them as Jiffy pots, but there's other similar type of things out there. So they're good because there's no plastic waste. You plant them straight into the gardening with the seedlings, which means that there's minimal root disturbance. So when you pull a plant out of the plastic container and plant it in the garden, it can disturb the roots a lot. It can then also disturb the plant's growth for a while before they can recover from that disturbance. So the biodegradable pots are great from that perspective, that they don't really interfere with the plant's growth at all when you transplant them out. The downside of it is that they do dry out much quicker. So if you're not paying as much attention to them in the nursery while you're watering them, they can dry out much quicker, and you can run into problems with them just not getting enough moisture. And also sometimes they can be a bit, they can fall apart reasonably easily. So you might be trying to, if you try to carry them from where you're growing them in the nursery through to where you're going to plant them in the garden, you have to be quite careful because they can actually break and start to fall apart. So then there's another option, which is not as common out there, but actually is quite a good way of growing seeds from an environmental perspective, because it uses no plastic or even biodegradable containers. So there's a system called soil blocks, which basically makes compressed cubes of soil, which hold themselves together just from the stickiness of the soil mix. And so there's no plastic waste involved at all with them. And some of the other great things about growing seedlings this way is they go through a process called air pruning. So the roots of the plant will grow out until they hit the edge of the cube of soil. And then when they hit the air, they'll just pause their growth and just sit there waiting to be planted into the soil. And then once you plant the soil cube out into the garden, those roots are just sitting there ready to grow straight out into the soil. So when even the biodegradable containers, when you grow a seedling in it, the roots become contained within that container, and it takes them a lot longer to find their way out into the kind of the natural soil that you're planting them into. But with the air pruning on the roots, they just sit there primed to grow straight out into the soil as soon as they're planted. But they are not very durable at all. You need to take a lot of care when you're watering them, at least to begin with, until the roots start to hold the soil together. And they can dry out the quickest out of every type of seed raising container that I mentioned, and also the tools for to create the soil blocks. I'm not sure what their pricing is exactly right now, but they're around $40-ish. So it's, if you're not growing huge numbers, then that can be a bit of a deterrent as well. So as I said earlier, the right temperature is one of the most important parts of germinating seeds. And it's the one, I think, where a lot of people go wrong. I think most people realize that to grow a seedling, you need to water it. That's, I think, pretty obvious. But having it at the right temperature, I think, is something that people miss a lot. So every different crop has a different optimum. So when you're wanting to grow whatever type of crop it is, lettuce or carrot or whatever it is, you should always check what the optimum germination temperatures are for that crop, because it can make the difference between planting a whole heap of seeds and getting 100% to germinate or getting 0 to germinate. So with that, when I'm talking about temperature, it's actually the temperature of the soil that's important, not the air. So you can actually just use a thermometer to measure the temperature of the soil. And you can change the temperature to make it hotter or colder depending on what you need for that different crop. So if you want it to, if it needs to be a bit warmer than what it would be outside, you can use a glass house or place it indoors near a window, or you can even use small electric heat mats. And if you need to cool it down, then you can use shade cloth or place it indoors, or you can also use fans to cool it down as well from the evaporation. And the other thing is light. So the seeds don't need, almost all seeds don't need light to germinate, but they do need the light as soon as they emerge from the soil. So if you have too little light, what you end up with is really stretched out weak seedlings, which is really bad for the plant. And so it's probably best to try to germinate the seeds in an area where they're going to have the light immediately when they come out of the emerge from the soil. So sunlight's the obvious, easiest way to get light, but if you need to, you can use electric lighting to either supplement the sunlight or instead of sunlight. If you need to use, like some people germinate the seedlings indoors because they have a nice warm spot, but that warm spot might not have light. So dampening off. So this is probably one of the biggest disheartening events that you can have growing seedlings. So dampening off usually what it is it's a fungal disease that kills the germinating establishing seedlings. So usually what you see is you don't see anything. So nothing emerges from the soil, and you think that there's something wrong with the seed. What happens is they germinate and they look like they're growing great for a couple of days, and then they just kind of shrivel up and fall over and die. So the dampening off is a whole heap of different, not a whole heap, but there's quite a few different funguses which are responsible for it. But they all have pretty similar needs to grow and become a problem. So that's they need it to be quite wet and quite still, so they don't like too much wind, and yeah, so they're more of a problem when a seedling is growing slowly and doesn't have the right conditions. So if you give the seed and seedling the optimum conditions, it will usually grow. The seedling will be healthy enough to grow healthily and strong and be able to deal with a bit of the fungal diseases if they're there. And also if the good growing conditions for the seedlings usually are not also the same good growing conditions for the fungus. So there's kind of this two-part thing to avoiding the problems with the dampening off. So the dampening off fungus are pretty much everywhere. So they can be on the soil, the seeds, in the water, and just blowing on the wind. So some people do a lot of sterilizing of their seed raising equipment because they're worried about contamination with dampening off and other diseases. That can happen, but the reality is that there's in nature, and there's so many different ways that these fungus can get into the soil that you can sterilize everything perfectly and then they can still just blow in on the wind. So it's one of those things where that's a personal preference. I personally don't bother sterilizing everything because on top of the the bad fungus that everyone's trying to sterilize to get rid of, there's also a whole heap of beneficial fungus which plants really require to live with. And if you have everything completely sterile, then they might miss out on the diseases, but they also miss out on all the beneficial fungus as well. Okay, so putting all of that into practice, the kind of general procedure for raising seeds is to start with check the temperature requirements to make sure that you're going to be able to meet those outdoors if you're planting the seeds directly outdoors, or that you've got some way of altering the environment to meet those requirements in a hothouse, in a little germination chamber, in a windowsill, whatever it is. So there's no point in buying a packet of tomato seeds and trying to germinate them when it's way too cold. It's just not going to happen no matter whatever you do. So then once you know that you've got the right time of year that you're wanting to do this and plant them, or that you've got some way of altering the environment to meet that temperature requirements, then you can just fill whatever container it is that you're going to use to raise the seeds with the seed raising mix, and moisten the seed raising mix down so it's nice and moist before you put any seeds in it. You make a little hole. The rule of thumb is about 3 times as deep as the seed's width. Place the seed in the hole and cover it over. You can just cover it with soil. I've found that vermiculite is actually a much better medium to cover the seeds with. I think that's for 2 reasons. One is that it holds moisture really well, so it holds lots of moisture right near the seed where it is, and also it kind of helps deter some of the insect pests like fungus gnats and some other things which can cause problems in nursery sorts of situations. So then, yeah, just want to water it in gently and place it in a location where the soil can be at the right temperature, and yeah, somewhere where there's also plenty of light ready for when the seed pops through, so it's ready to start photosynthesizing. And then you want to just water it in small amounts and frequently as needed. So you don't want it to dry out, but you also don't want it to be waterlogged. So just kind of monitoring it, making sure that it's not getting too dry and that it's not too wet still. And then after the seedlings emerge, if you want to add more fertilizer, that's the time to add a bit more, just to make sure it's got plenty of nutrients to get itself through to you're going to plant it out into the garden. Speaking of which, planting out into the garden is kind of where we're aiming to get. We're wanting the seedlings to be in the garden. So once you've kind of grown these seedlings and they're nice and established and they're getting strong enough that you can be able to remove them from their containers and put them into the garden. So then what you want to do is go through a little process called hardening off, which is basically just taking these seedlings which you've been growing in this very controlled environment and getting them used to life in the real world. So they're much more likely to have strong wind, have more direct sunlight and all these type of things out in the garden than they did have in the kind of nursery situation where they've been growing. So the types of things you can do is take them outside and put them in the outside conditions for a small amount of time, maybe an hour or so to start with, and then a few hours, and then over a course of about 4 or 5 days, kind of get up to leaving them out there. Or you can just do other things like just brushing your hands over them as a good way to get them used to kind of the same sort of effect as what the wind will have on them. But just, yeah, the idea is just so they're not just getting a shock going from this really nice growing environment to the reality of the elements out there in the garden. So some other tips are that it's always best to plant out the seedlings as soon as the roots fill the cells. As soon as the roots start becoming restricted by the container they're in, the plant is becoming restricted in its growth as well. So yeah, planting them out as soon as they're ready to go out, as soon as the roots have filled up the cell, then that's the best time to plant them out. And quite often that's when the top of the plant is actually a lot smaller than the type of seedlings that you might have seen in nurseries and shops. So quite often the seedlings in nurseries and shops have been sitting on the shelf or been in transit and other things, and they've grown in the pots for probably a lot longer than what they should have. So quite often the best time to plant out the seedling is when it will actually look quite a lot smaller than what you might think or might be expecting based on what you've seen available in nurseries. So don't plant if it's too hot. Doesn't matter even if it's something like a tomato that likes hot weather. If you plant out in a 30-degree or more day, it's going to not deal with that very well. It's going to wilt and it's going to cause problems for the growth of the plant. So anytime you set the plant back with root disturbance or it getting too hot or anything like that, it doesn't just affect it for the time while that's happening. It has a lag effect and will affect the growth of the plant for quite a while after it's been through that stress. So the less stress you can put on the seedlings, the better. And you want to plant into damp soil and water in immediately. So that's just to make sure that the plant isn't going through any extra stress. It's not going through water stress at the same time. Okay, so that was the end of the slides that I'd prepared. So I'm just going to hand back over to Danny for a moment from the City of Marion, and she's going to take a minute to talk about some stuff I think to do with the community gardens, and then we'll come back for some question time after that.
Thank you, John. We'll get straight back to John in about 1 minute. That's all I'm going to take. And I want to thank you again. There's so much information. I took loads of notes, and I've got questions too, so we'll get to questions in a second. I just want to let people know that community gardens are a great way to learn more about this sort of thing, and there's community gardens everywhere, no matter what state you're in, because there's people joining us all over Australia, which is great. Not only are they a great place to grow food, where you can all do this, it's also just a great place to skill share and connect with others in your community. So you've got community gardens around, get involved. There are 7 in community gardens. They're in, I'm just going to let you know, in City of Marion, Trott Park, Merino, Clovelly Park, Glandore, Mitchell Park, Oaklands and Bedford Park. So if you know anyone near there or live near there, please check them out. They're on our website. Jess will put all the links below. And there's potentially 2 new community gardens coming, one at Howick Cove and one at Dwyer Road. So we've got contacts for those below. We'll put all that in the link. But no matter where you are, please look at getting involved in your community gardens. There's going to be there's 7 and there'll hopefully be 9 in City of Marion soon, which is great. That's all I wanted to say about them, just to let you know where they were. I'm going to pass back over to John, who may be able to see the questions. If you do have questions, we'll be on for a little while yet answering, so feel free to type them into the Q&A down the bottom. And can I start with one? I would love to ask John if I can just ask one, because I've done this. I started my seeds inside, followed all those rules, and I accidentally left them outside for quite a few hours in the cold, not quite overnight, but I brought them in quite late. With them going from warm to a little bit cold and then coming back to warm again, could I have killed them?
So it's probably unlikely that you killed them. It might have just stressed them a little bit. So, so temperature is an interesting thing. The temperature is really important for the germination of the seeds. But once the seeds have germinated, the temperature is not anywhere near as important. So, once the seedlings are actually growing, the plants can tolerate a lot lower temperatures. So something like a tomato. It needs up around 25 to 30 degrees to something like that to germinate. But then once it's germinated, it can handle temperatures down around 10 degrees, 5 degrees overnight. It's fine. That won't really harm the plant. It'll slow down its growth. It won't grow as fast as it would if it was warmer, but it won't actually harm it. Most of those warm season crops, they can handle temperatures all the way down to freezing, but it's the freezing that's the problem. So a lot of the winter and cool season crops have kind of their own chemical anti-freezers built into them, so they don't actually freeze and cause problems from frosts and getting down below 0. So the problem when the plant gets below 0 is as the ice expands, it bursts the cells in the plant. So the problem is the bursting of the cells from the expanding, freezing water. But so with the cold season crops, that's not a problem, and for the warm season crops, it's only if it gets down to freezing. So letting them get a little bit cold at night, it's not going to be a huge problem unless it's down around 0. Yeah. Cool. So I'm just going to try to work out how to find these questions and answers. Here we go. Okay. All right. So I've got one here. How long does it take for seeds to germinate, and what crops should we start germinating now? Okay. So it's very variety specific. So some seeds take a lot longer to germinate than others. Something like a lettuce usually germinates and has its head up within a few days. Some other things can take a few weeks. So it kind of depends on the crop, but as a kind of rule of thumb, I would expect that most seeds should be showing their head above the soil within around about a week from planting them. And as for what to be starting to germinate now, so now is a good time to be germinating all your warm season crops. So they're things like tomatoes, capsicum, chilies, eggplant, pumpkin, any of those type of things which are really heat-loving plants. Now's a good time to be starting to germinate them because if you're germinating them now, it's going to take about 4 to 6 weeks before they're ready to plant out into the garden. And that will be a nice time of year where it's warm enough outside that hopefully, depending where you are, that you're not going to be getting any frost. So again, it comes back to those frosts for the warm season crops. So things like tomatoes, you just need to keep them out of the frost. So if you know when the last frost date is for your area, which you can usually find that information from the Bureau of Meteorology, you don't want to be planting them outside before the time of year when you usually have the last frost. So in the area where I'm growing, we actually are quite cool up in the hills, so we can have frost right through to the end of October. So I don't plant any tomatoes or anything like that out until right at the end of October or in the start of November. But if you're down closer to the coast, like a lot of people in the Marion Council area, you will probably be able to go a bit earlier than that. But yeah, so now is warm season crops. It's a great time, but also a lot of other things. Most other things you can be germinating at this time of year as well. It just might require you to use some sort of glass house or other way of warming up the warm season crops to get them to germinate. Okay, so it says, next question says, when you said the seedling pots need a drainage holes, does that include porous egg cartons and jiffy pots? So the answer is yes. So although those type of pots can let moisture in and out, it slows that moisture down a lot. So if you've planted a seedling into an egg carton and water it, that water can still stay in there for a long time before it eventually kind of evaporates out through the egg carton. A lot of the time, the moisture, even though the moisture won't actually run through and drip out of the egg carton will actually hold all the water in there, and it'll be mainly the evaporation off the surface of the egg carton that gets rid of the moisture. So yes, I would definitely still put drainage holes in egg cartons and jiffy pots. So next question, I was wondering if you have set up your seeds in a hothouse outside, just a temporary plastic one, or is it enough just to open up the flap and let the air in, or should they be totally taken out into direct sunlight? So the hardening off is a process to reduce the stress. So you don't need to do it, it's not necessary, it just reduces the stress, and so the plant would grow better. So So whatever you do, any steps you do to harden it off is going to be better than none. And just opening up the side of a hothouse to let air through or something like that is great. You know, if you had the time and were able to, it would still be good to take them out into full sunlight and full kind of wind conditions. But you know, we're all restricted by the realities of life, so the best you can do is better than nothing. So okay, so just wondering what type of fertilizer is best for young seedlings. Okay, so I use Blood and Bone. The reason I use Blood and Bone is because it's a powder, so that it can mix in very evenly into the seed raising mix. So you don't have to use that. You can use any, and I grow everything organically, so I'm only going to probably give advice on organic fertilizers, but you can use things like pelleted chicken manure pellets, and there's lots of other organic fertilizers out there. But specifically for raising seedlings, I prefer the powders because you can get a really nice even spread throughout the seed raising mix. How to scarify a seed in hot water, please. Okay, so most vegetable seeds don't require any sort of scarification. And the types of seeds that do require scarification, there's a lot of variation, and it's more complicated than I can just give in a short answer. I have some experience doing hot water scarification with native seeds, so things like acacias. And in those situations, one of the main methods I used was to put them in some sort of bag or tea strainer or some sort of container, and then dip them into water that had boiled like you would for a cup of tea. Dip them in there for about 30 seconds and then take them out and put them back under cold water and then plant them. So that's kind of one sort of method, but that is kind of specific to the plant that you're trying to grow. So that one might be a better question to Google specifically for the type of plant that you're trying to grow. Okay, next question. Are heirloom seeds the same as organic seeds? Okay, so I could give a full 1 hour talk on this, but I'll try to keep it down to a couple of minutes. So, okay, so heirloom seeds are seeds which basically are seeds which are open sourced. They're seeds which number one, anyone's allowed to save the seeds from. They don't have any sort of plant breeders' rights or anything attached to them. They're also seeds which from plants which if you save the seed from an heirloom seed, those seeds will grow a plant that looks the same as the parent plant. So the kind of the opposite, I guess, or what's different from an heirloom seed is F1 seeds, which is what I guess the majority of the crops grown today use. And the F1 seed is a hybrid seed. And what that means is that they've taken a very specific mother plant and a very specific father plant and mixed them together to create a very specific child, which that child, when it produces seeds, they will not look the same as that plant. They can revert back to some of the traits from the father or some of the traits from the mother, and you won't get that same plant as you do with an heirloom variety. You get the same plant as you save the seeds from. So organic seeds basically means that the seeds were grown organically. Organic means that no synthetic fertilizers or chemicals were used. So an organic seed refers to the way that the seeds were grown, and an heirloom seed refers to the type of plant that the seed has come from. Okay, so How relevant is it to score large seeds or soak or start with boiling water, etc.? Okay. Again, there's so many different types of seeds and they require different types of treatments, but I don't do any sort of treatments of any seeds, including large seeds, for any sort of vegetables. Again, it's a bit different if you're trying to germinate native plants or some flowers and stuff like that. But I don't do any treatment or pre-soaking. You can do things like pre-soaking peas and beans and some of the larger seeds, and it might buy you might get it to germinate one day earlier or something, but to me it seems like a lot of extra work for not making a huge difference that I've experienced. So okay, what is a good and affordable small greenhouse you would suggest? Okay, so it depends on what you call small. You can use anything from you can buy little seed germination chambers, which are made specifically for that. They have a tray on the bottom and they have a clear plastic top that goes over them, and that's, they're about 30 centimeters by 50 centimeters or something like that. So that's kind of pretty small. Once you start going much smaller than that, it's a bit harder to maintain or to monitor the moisture and temperature inside them. So those type of things usually have a little bit of a vent that you can open or shut to kind of let airflow through a bit and to alter the temperature a bit. If you have very small kind of greenhouse situations, like some people do by putting a cut soft drink container over plants and stuff like that, it's very hard to know what's going on inside of there, and they can get very hot very quick, and that can cause some problems. So kind of the bigger the better in some ways. It just has more buffering. Things don't go as wrong as quickly. But as far as if you're wanting some sort of greenhouse that's kind of big enough that you can walk into and work within, you can buy all sorts of kind of greenhouse kits off of the internet. I personally have used one, it's called, the brand is Shelter Logic. I don't know if I should be mentioning brands or not, but that one seemed to be very sturdy and lasts quite a while, but it's also a bit more expensive, I think, getting up to around $350 or something for something like that. So, anything in between those is fine. The main thing is it needs to be reasonably sealed to keep the warmth in, and it needs to be fairly clear. It doesn't have to be 100% clear. It can be translucent, that's fine, but it just needs to let through a fair bit of light. And other than that, there's not really, that's kind of the main thing, is just to let the light in, but not let the heat out. So yeah, anything that does that job will kind of, will fit the bill. So, okay. Hi, John. I'm trying to grow papaya in my backyard, but have not been successful. The fruits are green, but never ripe to yellow. What have I done wrong? Okay, so papaya is a tropical fruit or a subtropical fruit. So if you're in South Australia, then it might just be that you don't have a long enough, warm enough growing season, the right conditions to get it to ripen. I might not be the best person to answer that. There's a group in South Australia called the Rare Fruit Society, and I'm sure there's heaps of people in that would be able to answer that question better than me. So if you want to follow that up, I'd probably look them up to get a slightly better answer. Most of my seedlings' first leaves all look the same, and then the next set of leaves are the shape of their normal leaves. Are these first leaves just to get started? Will they stay on the plant when it grows up, and do all seeds do this? That is a very good question, and I can't believe that I didn't actually mention that at all in my presentation. So the first two leaves two leaves that poke out of the ground on most plants are what are called cotyledons. And cotyledons are basically used by the plant as protection as it pushes up through the soil, because as you can imagine, pushing past all that soil could scratch and damage the plant. So the cotyledons are basically protective set of leaves which wrap around the plant as it grows up through the soil. When it emerges from the soil, those leaves open up and allow the rest of the plant that you recognize as like with the normal shaped leaves to continue to grow up without having any damage to the growing point of the plant. So yep, the cotyledons, that's their main function, is as a protective kind of sheath as the plant grows up through the soil. There's kind of two main types of plants that are divided into monocots and dicots. So one cotyledon, and they're things like grasses, and then dicots or two cotyledons, which are most of the other broadleaf plants. And so that's why pretty much all the broadleaf plants, or the plants that you recognize as non-grasses, they pretty much all have the two cotyledons, and they quite often have very similar shape because they are not representative of what the plant will look like. They're just a protective layer that served its purpose as soon as the plant has started to grow its true leaves. Okay, so next question. When you plant the seed pods out, how deep do you plant them? As deep as the pod or deeper? Okay, so depending what you're planting, you're usually planting just the seed, not the seed pod. The pod is usually the protective coating around the outside of seeds that contains the seeds and protects them while they're developing. So usually for something like a pea, you can imagine peas in a pod. So the pod is actually the kind of fruit with all the different seeds in it together. So for most plants, you plant out the seed, not the pods, but there are some plants like beetroot and silver beet and stuff like that, which you actually plant out the seed pod because the seeds are actually tiny and hidden inside that pod. It was really hard to get them out. So if you're planting, the rule of thumb for seeds is to plant them about 3 times as deep as the seed is thick. So if you've got a little round seed that is like about 1 millimeter across, so something like a broccoli, then planting it about 3 millimeters deep is fine. Having said that, that's the rule of thumb. You can plant things quite a lot deeper and shallower than what their optimum is, and plants have a way of surviving. They'll push on through and usually make it happen. So unless you're planting the seed kind of, your full finger depth into the soil, it's got a good chance that it will still come through. But usually most things around 5 millimeters is a good sort of depth to go for. Okay, so
John, sorry to jump in. There's one that came on the chat, which I might ask you, or I might be able to answer, and then we might have to wrap up. We might have time for Hannah's one quickly. But one came through about tips on growing natives from seed. I know a few tips on it, but I didn't know if you wanted to say how it was a bit different. Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I'll do some quick thoughts, and then I'll let you fill in if anything that I miss. So natives are much more likely to require different treatments than vegetable seeds. So a lot of natives have evolved to grow in environments where fire is a big part of the ecology. So there's quite a few natives which require either heat treatment or smoke treatment or something like that for the seed to actually get the correct stimulus to germinate. So depending on what the variety is, some sort of heat or smoke treatment or scarification, which is either cutting or sanding off part of the seed shell to let the water in, that they can really help. There's a huge variety of native plants which have had no real research done on germinating the seeds. So there's a lot of trial and error, and it's there's some common things like most acacias need some sort of heat treatment. Banksias need some sort of heat and or smoke treatment, things like that. But there's also a lot of plants which there's a bit of trial and error required to because there hasn't been good research on. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Danny.
All I was going to say is they probably need less fertilizer than your veggies would need, because they wouldn't want too much of that. They also want as free draining, most of them, as possible. And as soon as ours germinate, we put them out, although they still get a bit of misting irrigation, we put them out in full sun, even when they're quite little in the middle of summer. So yeah, lots of sun, more sun for natives than you're used to if you're in a sunny part of Australia. Anyway, I think I'll pass back to John for the last question from Hannah on the Q&A.
Okay, so last question is, what's the best way to incorporate coir into the seed raising mix? Does it need to be cut up and mixed into the compost, or can it be put in as one layer? Okay, so the coir which I use is not the same fibrous coir that you use for lining hanging baskets or things like that. It's actually coir that's been chopped up into small pieces to be used in seed raising mixes. So you can purchase that from most gardening supply places, and yeah, it's usually in a hard block that you wet, and then it expands and falls apart into the little pieces once it's wet. So it's a slightly different type to the kind of really coarse long fibers of coir, which a lot of people immediately think of when they hear coir. So yeah, I understand that question. So then once, if you've got that really chopped up coir, then you can just mix it in any way that you would mix anything else in the soil. So tipping it between two buckets. I use a cement mixer because I'm doing it on a larger scale, but any sort of way of mixing it in is fine. Yep.
Great. Thanks, John. I'm just going to jump in because there are a couple of questions that came to us earlier this evening from someone who couldn't make it. And they asked, do you have any tips on making homemade propagation tray and lid from items found around the house?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a bit earlier, the trick is to not try to make it too small. The smaller you make it, the harder it is to monitor what's happening inside of it, and the harder it is to even it out. So the bigger it is, the more buffering it has, the less likely something is to go wrong. So one thing I've seen people use, which seem to work really well, is kind of those translucent or clear storage containers that people use for storing things under beds or in cupboards or whatever else. So they're normally kind of a clear container and have a lid for it. So you can usually just tip them upside down and use the lid as a bit of a water catchment, so you're not, the water that's dripping out of the seedlings isn't just going all over the ground or wherever it is. And then use the bottom of the container as the lid to put over the top of the seedlings. Yeah, so that's probably one which it's something that's common in a lot of houses and requires very little effort to build or whatever else. Otherwise, yeah, you can make it out of anything as long as it meets those requirements of holding the heat in. So that means it has to be reasonably sealed and letting light in. So it needs to be clear or translucent. Yeah.
And one very last question for this evening. Are there any tricks to growing Cape gooseberry seeds and planting them in the garden?
Yeah, sure. So Cape gooseberries are distantly related to tomatoes, but they have very similar growing requirements to tomatoes. So if you've grown tomatoes before, grow your Cape gooseberries almost identically to how you've done tomatoes, and that'll be fine. If you haven't grown tomatoes before, they're a warm season crop. They need to be quite warm to germinate, so they probably need some sort of heating to get them to germinate this time of year. So I think off the top of my head, it would be around that 25-degree mark that they would require to be able to get them to germinate. They are a pretty hardy plant. They tolerate most soils, and depending on the variety you get, there are some that are kind of more of a vining variety that'll grow along the ground, and then you have some more upright varieties which stand up more. So either way, it's good to stake them like you would a tomato, to hold them up off the ground, just to let more airflow around them, so that helps prevent some of the leaf diseases. Yeah, so the only other thing is that they are quite a long season crop, so you'd be better off to get them in as early as you can, so they've got a nice long time over summer where it's warm for them to grow. They can take quite a long time to fruit, but once they start fruiting, they can also continue to fruit for a long time as well. So the earlier the better. It increases your chances of them getting to fruit, and increases the amount of time you'll be able to harvest fruit off of them. Yeah.
Fabulous.
And I guess the one last thing for that is that they grow in a little brown, in a little husk, which you can peel off of the fruit. And the best time to pick them and eat them is when that husk has browned off and turned kind of like papery. And usually once they fall off the plant to the ground, they're usually fine to eat still for quite a while, because that paper husk protects them from insects and other things damaging the fruit. So.
Fascinating. That's awesome. That's been so informative, John. We're so grateful to have you with us this evening.